The UK government has borrowed £270 billion this financial year to pay for the COVID pandemic. That is, by any measure, an awful lot of money. More than enough, you would imagine, to keep the Chancellor awake at night. Rishi Sunak will be worrying whether the size of the UK's debt burden means we are storing up problems for the future. It's worth remembering that most modern economies spend a little more on services than they raise through taxes each year. They make up the difference by borrowing money from investors on the international market. The difference, called the deficit, usually gets bigger when the economy takes a hit. The UK has just taken a massive hit, and the deficit has ballooned. The extra money that we have borrowed over the last 12 months means that the country's outstanding debt will rise to £2.3 trillion in this financial year. But is this too much? How can you tell when a country has borrowed beyond its means? Well, the bigger the economy, the more debt it can handle. So the best way to gauge a country's indebtedness is by looking at its debt to GDP ratio. Economists have traditionally argued that there is a tipping point where debt to GDP gets too high and starts to hamper economic growth. However, what that point may be is the subject of fierce debate, and is particularly hard to gauge when global central banks are keeping interest rates so low. In 2010, the World Bank conducted a study of 99 countries to try and find the point at which sovereign debt turns bad. Its conclusion? A debt to GDP ratio of 77%. Well, it's been a long time since the UK's number was this low. George Osborne used to argue that the country was flirting with economic disaster if debt to GDP went above 90%. But this figure too is very much in our rearview mirror. Last year, debt to GDP went through 100% for the first time since the 1960s, and it's forecast to go through 110% this year. But if 77% and 90% were not the disaster that was predicted, why should we be worried about 100% or even 110%? The current situation is not unprecedented. The UK's debt to GDP peaked at nearly 260% in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and didn't get back down below 100% until 1963. In fact, if you chart the number over the last 300 years, the ratio has fluctuated wildly, but the average has been around 100%. It's also important to view the UK in a global context. Of the 7 largest developed economies in the world, only Canada and Germany have a lower debt to GDP than the UK, while France, Italy, the US and Japan all have higher ratios than the UK. Nevertheless, Rishi Sunak is keen to get debt to GDP back into double figures. He could tackle the UK's debt mountain by raising taxes, cutting spending, or a bit of both. However, many economists warn that doing so anytime soon could actually hamper the recovery, which is only just getting started. The other way to lower debt to GDP figure is by boosting the economy. So if higher taxes and lower spending put the brakes on growth, it could, perversely, achieve the exact opposite of what Sunak is aiming for. Now, the economics textbooks will tell you that a large deficit leads to higher interest rates, higher inflation, and a depreciating currency. But those books were written before central banks started experimenting with quantitative easing and record low interest rates, which vastly reduced the cost of borrowing. Economists say this makes the situation much less urgent. Indeed, inflation is still well below the Bank of England's target rate, and the pound is actually strengthening. Yes, borrowing costs have ticked up in recent weeks, but they are still only at the still very low level they were before the pandemic. There's no guarantee these conditions will last, but they suggest that the Chancellor at least has time. That all being the case, why is Sunak making noises about raising taxes now? The answer to that may lie more with politics than economics. Pollsters say that in focus groups, many voters bring up the growing national debt without even being prompted. They understand why spending has shot up, but they strongly believe this money needs to be paid back, and soon. The Chancellor will have an eye on his party's reputation for financial prudence, and may be worrying that it is getting tarnished. How can he berate Labour for believing in magic money trees if he appears to have suddenly discovered a forest of them at the Treasury? He may also be calculating that any belt tightening through higher taxes and or lower spending will result in some pain, and the longer he puts that off, the closer we get to the next general election.